forest garden is a three-dimensional garden made up of trees, shrubs, perennials, ground cover plants and so on, all interdesigned in a special way. So this forest garden started off in 1994 as a pasture field, so there was nothing growing here. It's bordered by the high conifers you can see to the west there, and ash trees. They're just outside the forest garden. And I chose this field. I had a choice of sites on the Dartington estate, and I chose this site for various reasons, but one reason was it had fantastic protection from the west. So due west is where the ash and conifer trees are over there, and you know, shelter in a windy part of the country. Shelter is worth its weight in gold. It will improve the growth of trees, you know, twofold probably, and anything fruiting will actually, you know, become productive much more quickly, and production will build up much more quickly in a sheltered site. So although there's some shading issues obviously near that big edge there, which is not a problem because there are shade tolerant things you can put there, you know, I'm quite prepared to put up with that in return for fantastic shelter. If I hadn't had shelter there, I'd have had to grow shelter, and probably I would have grown something fast growing like Italian alder, which is tall trees within the forest garden here. You can see are Italian alders. Those are 16 years old from seed, and they're a fantastic windbreak tree. Get very big very quickly, and they would have given me decent protection by now. But in the process, you know, this wouldn't be so established if I'd had to grow shelter. So sheltering the main trees that are forming the highest layer, if you like, or canopy layer in the forest garden. It's not very high trees everywhere. Because, you know, shade is an issue, so you can't have too many high trees because you start to get too much shading beneath. And then I underplanted most of the forest garden over about the next 10 years. It doesn't have to take you that long when you make a forest garden, but on this site various things led me to that kind of length. One is the size. It's just over 2 acres, which as forest gardens go is probably above average, you know, in this country. There's people making forest gardens from up to 5 acres or so, bigger than this, right down to, you know, small back garden sized forest gardens, where obviously you might have to make some compromises in terms of tree size and stuff. So 2 acres is a lot to plant out, to underplant especially. The trees aren't so bad on 2 acres. It's only about 200 trees or something, you know, you're going to plant. But the underplanting is, you know, much more of a task really, and that's something you need to plan in advance how long it's going to take you. So because I was the only one doing the work, I portioned that up into around 10 years of underplanting. So pretty much most of it is underplanted now. There are little patches that get replanted every now and then because I'm experimenting, and one of the experiments I'm doing is mixing different plants in the perennial layers and see what grows with what, because there's very little serious work been done on that or written about it. And sometimes those experiments work, and of course sometimes they don't, and if they don't I'll often mulch them out sometimes with areas of cardboard, like you can just see in amongst this area there are some areas of cardboard, and then replant with something else. So there are little bits of replanting on an ongoing basis, but most of it is fairly well underplanted. Okay, so from where you're standing now, this is quite an open and sunny entrance into the forest garden here. Just in this area up here, there's not going to be any higher trees really than this apricot, and the tree with all the tiny little pale green fruits on is Szechuan pepper. We'll have a look at that in a minute. And there's a mulberry to its left, and that's a type of dwarf chestnut there that looks like a chestnut tree. So fairly low trees here with quite an open sunny area. So there's quite a lot of interesting perennial vegetables that need quite good light conditions right in front of us here. So one which has just finished flowering, it's got these, well, a few flowers left, these little yellow flowers, quite big plants, a lot of them have keeled over a bit. Is Turkish rocket, it's a very nice perennial brassica, and the young flower shoots, even now, quite nice to nibble. So as you come past this, if you want to, it tastes a bit like a mustardy version of broccoli. If you want to nibble on one of those and go past, it's fine. The main crop on this is before these flowers open, and it's like broccoli, you know, and the unopened flower clump basically is the main thing you eat. You can also eat the leaves, but they're very, very hot at this time of year. They're better in spring. You know, they're fiery hot at this time of year, the leaves are. There's some other perennial vegetables. So, for instance, you can see a plant that looks like nasturtium climbing up some canes just there in front of the Szechuan pepper. And that is a type of nasturtium. It's a tuberous nasturtium called mashua, and that's a tuber crop from South America. It's one of the Andean tuber crops. It grows very well here. You can eat the leaves, they're peppery like ordinary nasturtium leaves. You don't get a lot of flowers on this one, but you get big tubers, you know, decent potato-sized tubers on that, and lots of them, and that grows very well. And as you can, it clambers. So you know, I've given it some canes, and it clambers into a bush, and that's how clambering things tend to grow in the wild. They're often on the southern edge, you know, of a shrub or a bush, and they can clamber up to get into the light. So, you know, in a forest garden, I'm trying to mimic what happens in nature as much as possible, and you know, that's one reason that a forest garden is very low input. It's because on the scale of, you know, agriculture, the further you are from a forest, which is what the land is trying to get to in our climate, the further you are from a forest, the more energy you have to put in to maintain it. So, you know, an arable crop or annual vegetables are the most energy intensive, because in most areas anyway, the ground is cultivated every year. And soil cultivation is very, very energy intensive. You know, ploughing or digging, whatever way it's done, is very energy intensive. And actually, ultimately, I don't think agriculture is sustainable with almost total reliance on annual crops in the future. So that will have to change. But as you get further and further towards a forest, the energy you have to put in to maintain your system gets less and less, because you know, if you left any bit of land in this country, apart from on a mountaintop perhaps, and did nothing, a forest would emerge. It might take several decades, depends how fast the succession happens, but that is what the land is trying to get to. And so because this system is distinctly forest-like, you know, it's not a natural forest, of course, it is a very low energy input system. So as we walk along here, you'll see a couple more tuber crops. One which is just climbing up the canes the other side of this apricot tree, and you can see it looks a bit like bindweed, the leaves on that. That's actually yam. That's Chinese yam, which is hardy. There's some hardy yams. Yams are not all tropical, so I grow two types of yam. Yeah, that's the ones you like, Tom. And they produce fantastic tubers, really lovely roasted. It's one of our favourite vegetables as a family. And a bit further on, as we walk along, you'll see there's a big area down here of actually Chinese artichoke, which is another tuber crop with the leaves. Leaves look very similar to betony. If you know what our native betony looks like, it's the same family. It's very similar looking leaves, and that forms smallish tubers, but lots of them. And again, a very nice perennial tuber crop. Okay.
So do you dig them up each like autumn and then replant in the same place, or wherever you feel like replanting?
Yes, most of these tuber crops I'll dig and leave some in the ground as I go. So it just regrows in the same place. I mean, you know, you could do that of course with potatoes, but of course potatoes are so prone to disease that you'll very quickly get a diseased potato crop after a year or two. You know, so it's not a viable thing to do with potatoes, but it is with you know, things like this. And it's one of a number of members of this family that are all used as a spice, which includes several of this kind of size. In fact, we'll pass another one, Nepalese pepper, later on, which is about this size. Some are smaller, so Japanese pepper, which is called sancho, is a smaller shrub, about more like head height. It's probably better for small gardens, and they're all used as spices. So these fruits you can see, which are still quite young here, if you rub those, they also are aromatic, same as the leaves. These ripen in September, and they go reddish. And unlike black pepper, where it's the seed that is the pepper, on Szechuan pepper and related peppers, it's not the seed itself. There is one black seed inside each fruit here. The seed itself is tasteless. What is peppery is the little papery shell around it, the fruit shell basically. That is peppery and aromatic as well, so it's not identical to black pepper. And every species has a different aroma to it. This one is particularly citrusy, and others, when we pass Nepalese pepper, I'll point that out, and you'll be able to tell the difference in fragrance, quite a difference in fragrance to that one. Although these fruits are small, it's actually quite fast to harvest. I harvest a whole bunch at a time, stalks and all, in September. I just lay them out to dry, under cover, usually in the polytunnel for a week or something, and then put it through a sieve to get rid of the stalks. And the fruit shells, as it were, the pepper, and the seeds all just go into a pepper mill. You know, yeah, you can take the seeds out if you want, it doesn't make any difference. And actually, if you buy Szechuan pepper, you often get the seeds with it, because somebody's selling it by weight, so they get more for their money that way. So, you know, that's fine. So, you know, we have that in a pepper mill, you know, on our table at home. And, you know, one bush can be incredibly productive. It's self-fertile. I usually pick about 2 kilos, and that's not including the really high ones. You know, I'm not going to try and get the high ones, because we've got more than enough as it is from one bush. So they're very productive as well. The young leaves are also used as a flavouring, often in cooked dishes and pickles and stuff like that in China, and similarly in Japan for Japanese pepper. So it's a multi-stemmed thorny shrub, as you can see, but like most fruiting plants, the fruit crop is born, you know, on the surface of the canopy, so you don't have to delve into it very much, you know, to get many of the fruits. So it's really easy, no pests, no diseases. It's a good bee plant when it flowers. About a month ago it flowered. All you have to do is harvest the fruits. There's no other care needed, so it's a really easy one.
This is roughly a 20-year tree then?
It's about 15. It's about 15. Yeah. And just behind you, in fact, and above you, is a mulberry. So this is white mulberry, which is just finishing flowering. You can see the flowers on the branches there, just starting to set. And I have several mulberries in the forest garden. Very easy to grow fruit plants. They do need some shelter because the branches are brittle, so in exposed places you'll get branch breakages on mulberries. And I'll show you one. This is not a named variety, but I have a named variety of a black mulberry further in the forest garden, which I'll point out when we get there. So to kill off the grasses, I've used big areas of sheet mulching to kill off grasses, because I don't use chemicals in terms of, you know, herbicides and so on. I use various types of sheet mulch, and I'll show you a bit. In fact, I'll show you further on. There's several examples I can show you in one place, so I'll talk about that more there. As we walk through this this section here, you'll see probably several plants you recognise. Some you might have in your own gardens, and you may not realise some of them are edible. So one is Aquilegia, columbine. Lots of garden varieties of Aquilegia. The leaves and flowers are very good in salads. Pretty tender, and you know, all through the season they stay quite tender. So that's a good one. In front of them here is one of the mallows just starting to flower. This is wood mallow, Malva sylvestris. All the mallows have good edible leaves. These ones, some of these are looking a bit manky. Obviously I wouldn't eat them if they're looking a bit manky, but wood mallow is one of my favourites actually for the leaf quality in salads, very good. Of course you can use the flowers as well. That's a native perennial, as are many of the other mallows you'll see in the garden. The big leaf plant I'm standing next to is Japanese butterbur, which has edible leaf stalks. That's a perennial vegetable in Japan, quite well known in Japan. And as we go further on, you'll see a little bit further back there's an area of Solomon's seal, which I'm sure some of you will know. And again, you know, Solomon's seal is a lovely early spring perennial vegetable. You eat the young shoots when they're about, you know, a foot high or something. In spring you can cut that whole first flush of young shoots and treat them like asparagus. So just steam them lightly, they only need a few minutes, and they taste like sweet asparagus, is basically the flavour. And then obviously after that you need to let them come up again, reshoot and to regain their energy. But they like, Solomon seal loves shady positions, as does Aquilibra, so there's lots of perennial vegetables like these, that will grow in shade. Whereas most of the annual vegetables that people grow will not grow in shade because they're all from sunny places, like the onion family, most of which is sunny, of course not wild garlic, which is down there. The cabbage family, which is from the seashore, and things like the squash family and courgettes and sweet corn and potatoes. These are all full sun annual, mostly annual crops, some of them perennial. And if you try and grow them in shade, they won't crop at all. Okay, so you can't put annual vegetables in a place like this and expect to get a crop. It won't happen. You can have annual vegetables within a forest garden, and I do, but you have to have an open, sunny spot or sunnier spot, for them to go in. You can't have them under trees. But there are, as I say, plenty of perennial vegetables you can grow under trees, just that most people don't know about them because we're not very good at using perennial vegetables in this country. Artichokes and rhubarb, I suppose, are probably two that most people know and use, but apart from that there's very few others, and it's partly the way that that agriculture or horticulture has developed over the past hundreds of years, that there's been an emphasis on annuals, whereas perennials have been forgotten pretty much, and there's a lot of fantastic edible perennials.
Excuse me, is this burdock here or not?
No, that is a type of rhubarb.
All right.
And I'll show you another one. These are not neat, tidy places. Okay, and that's completely deliberate because basically every bit of neatness and tidiness costs energy and reduces the efficiency of your system. My philosophy is to reduce neatness and tidiness to a minimum. Because it just costs energy. One bit of neatness and tidiness that I do is cut the grass paths, because that makes access a lot easier. You don't want to be wandering around in wet grass that's that long. It can get a bit miserable. So I mean that's something I am prepared to do, of course. But in terms of neatness and tidiness in other places, like behind me, for example, there's not a lot. That doesn't mean to say we don't weed. We do weed. You have to weed. If you don't weed, this will become a forest of probably ash trees, mostly. So there's no such thing as a no-weed garden. It's not true. You'll just end up with a woodland. But we don't try and keep things neat and tidy and places in their own, everything in its own place necessarily. If plants want to wander, that's absolutely fine most of the time. That's one way that horticulture based on annuals is very inefficient. It's because it takes an awful lot of energy to produce what you're getting out. So when you're looking at yields, it is not enough just to say, look at a field of whatever, a field of onions or a field of wheat, and say, look, it's fantastic. I'm getting N tons per acre of whatever it is. That actually is meaningless unless you relate it to the energy you've put in to grow that. Conventional agriculture that uses pesticides and herbicides and a lot of chemicals is incredibly energy intensive. All that energy goes into making the chemicals, making the oil for the tractors, making the tractors themselves, blah blah blah. Actually makes, if you relate the energy put in to grow a crop to the energy value of the crop you get out, it's pretty poor. And that's one measure of sustainability. And biological efficiency can be measured as the ratio of energy out over energy in. And in those terms, a forest garden is extremely efficient. That doesn't mean to say, any one particular crop yields more than its annual equivalent. So this is Good King Henry, for example, down here, this patch here, which is a fantastic perennial spinach crop. But if you relate that, if you measure the yield of that and compare it, with the yield of an annual crop of spinach that you've grown, just measuring the yield, probably spinach would come out top. in that year. But of course this is perennial, so it yields year after year after year. So you have to, you know, change your calculation for that. And also this takes almost no work once it's planted, whereas with spinach you've got to sow it, you've got to weed it, you've got to thin it out, blah blah blah. So you know, it's not enough just to look at sheer outputs. And of course this is growing in combination with lots of other plants, so very often there's more than one thing sharing the same space, more than one crop, you know, so you have to count the yields in that space rather than just the yield of individual crops.
Depends how many people you're trying to feed, I suppose, doesn't it? How many people you're trying to feed who aren't growing food, who aren't growing anything. So that's why we've got into the habit of having to grow
Sure.
so much with such labour intensive.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm sometimes asked, you know, it's all very well, but can agroforestry feed the world? You know, that's a typical question people will throw at me.
Yeah.
And my answer is that's a wrong question.
Right.
You know, the question is, what is sustainable?
Yeah.
And therefore, what is a sustainable world population? Which is probably a lot less than it is now, I have to say.
It also depends on how much you're prepared to pay, because it's efficient to grow, but not necessarily to harvest in a large commercial.
Yeah, well, you know, most forest gardens are not commercial. Most people growing forest gardens are growing food or other things for themselves or their families. You know, there are one or two people starting commercial forest gardens in this country now, but they're amending the system to make it more efficient for harvesting. Certainly, you know, you've obviously got to take that into account. But that's less common, you know, and if you look at forest gardens throughout the world, you know, they're very, very common, particularly in the tropics and subtropics, and there it's mainly people growing food for their household. You know, they might get one or two, if they have a bumper crop of something, they'll sell it as a bonus, you know, but that's not usually the primary function, you know, of their forest garden. Okay, so the shrub we've just come under, which is just a few days past peak flowering, they're just starting to brown a little and fall off the bracts, unfortunately, but it's still pretty impressive, is Chinese dogwood. So that's Cornus cousa chinensis, which is, you sometimes see it in ornamental gardens for this, the flowering. But following this, you of course get a whole tree covered in fruit. What will become the fruit you can see in the middle of each of the four bracts there, and they turn into knobbly, kind of lychee shaped fruits, about 25 to 30 millimeters diameter, turn dark red beginning of October, and fantastic flavour to them. It's a really nice fruit crop, and again looks after itself. Doesn't have any problems, no pests or diseases, you know, you just have to leave it to get on with it. And you also get this fantastic display of flowers, you know, in summer.
Did you plant that from seed?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I grew that from seed, that one.
So what kind of dogwood is it? Specific?
Chinese.
Dogwood.
Yeah. You can't eat native dogwood fruits, unfortunately. But there's lots of Cornus species that do have good edible fruits.
Do you peel them, or do you just eat the whole lot?
I usually eat the whole lot as long as they're really ripe. If they're a little under, the skins can be slightly bitter still. So that is basically how nutrients get spread out in the forest garden. So that again is why it's low input, is that I'm not having to do that. I'm not having to make compost and put it round trees that have a big fertility demand. Basically the system is doing it for me.
And did you bring fungi? Did you inoculate fungi into the soil?
I inoculated most of my trees before I planted them, the roots. You can, with these kind of fungi called mycorrhizal fungi, you can buy in commercial preparations. I mean, Root Grow is quite well known one now, and you can either sprinkle that in planting holes. It contains the spores of the right species, or you can make a root, a dip in a bucket with it and dip roots in and then plant them out. So. That can certainly be worth doing. If you do nothing, of course, the fungi will turn up in time. They'll be around, they'll be in forests anyway, but you might have a 5 or 10 year gap before they start to inoculate everything well. So I think it's probably worth the extra investment to make sure that the right fungi are there from the word go.
Is there any research into whether they're sensitive to pH, soil pH? I mean, how do you know whether they've died, or will they definitely take in all soils?
Well, the commercial preparations contain spores from about 20 species, so that covers a big range of soil types and also tree types. So with using that, you're pretty sure that it'll work. Yeah. Okay. Planting here, it's quite jungly, and again, that's all intentional. I don't want to have many open gaps because it's only invitations for plants that I don't want to come in, which are usually ash trees, or perhaps brambles. So there's lots going on here. At the back there's a berberis, which has just finished flowering. Let's see, 1 or 2 yellow flowers still on it, but that's an extra element of windbreak from the west because this is quite a thin strip in terms of width of conifers. And there's an open field the other side, and you can see through, where the light is. That's the field the other side. So, and they haven't got many branches low down, so the wind can whistle underneath them a little bit. So that's an extra element of windbreak, really. And fantastic bee plants for berberis. You can eat all berberis fruits, but they're very small, not really worth mainly trying to eat. And the birds love them too. So I don't really regard it as a fruit crop. In front of those, you can see a line of conifers, and those are plum yews. That's a Chinese fruit plant. You can see the fruits on this one forming, and they're not the same family as yew. It's a different family, Cephalotaxus. But like yew, you get female and male trees, or shrubs in this case, really. And you've got to have both if you want fruit to form. So I planted out a line of six I grew from seed here, and there's 3 of each in fact. That one's a male at the end, so no fruits on that, but it's a female next to it here. And the fruits on plum yew are really nice to eat. They ripen after everything else in November, after some frosts, and they turn from green to brown and become soft with a flavour like butterscotch with a bit of pine resin flavour in there as well, kind of resinous flavour to them. Very nice eating, and very shade tolerant fruits as well. And in front of those, a few other things that are more common and you'll recognise. So for example, that flowering quince, this is just Japonica, Pinamelius japonica, which has, the fruits are very small and still green on it, you can see, but of course they get to about 5 centimetres diameter and turn yellowish green when they're ripe in early autumn. Very easy to grow plant, well, it's in a lot of people's gardens really, but as a fruit plant it's great. I really highly value that fruit, not as a fruit to just eat because it's very acid, but it's very citrusy, particularly this one is particularly lemony. Other Pinamelius are sometimes more orangey in terms of the citrus flavour in them, and I make summer drinks mostly from these fruits, like still lemonade type drinks.
Juicing them or?
I whiz them in a blender to get the flavour from them. Also there are things like red currants. This is a red currant here, and of course in a normal garden situation you don't normally see red currants, maybe bushes 2 metres high, but that's how high they'll grow if you don't prune them every year. And I don't prune them every year because they fruit perfectly well without that. There's no reason to prune if you don't need to. So I would certainly question ordinary gardening wisdom that says you've got to prune everything every year because it's just a load of work, and sometimes it's completely pointless. Sometimes pruning can be useful. I'm not saying never prune, but I always start from a basis of not pruning and only prune if it's really necessary. And if a fruiting plant like this continues to put on lots of new growth for future fruiting and fruits well, that's fine. Leave it be, just let it get on with it. So a lot of my red currants are this kind of size, and other common fruit bushes as well. So yes, I was going to say a bit about bamboos because I grow a lot of bamboos. You'll see some more as we walk around the forest garden, and I grow them as dual purpose crops for edible bamboo shoots and for canes as well, for garden uses and so on. And they can be incredibly productive plants as well as being very beautiful and everything else. And I probably would never have a garden now without bamboos because I think they're so useful. So in our country we usually divide bamboos into two sorts, you know, bamboos that form neat round clumps and don't try and expand, sometimes called well behaved, and bamboos that try and expand and sometimes called badly behaved, or you know, worse than that. But if you're looking at bamboo as a crop, you want one of the spreading ones because they're much more productive, but they need management. Otherwise they'll just continue expanding. So this one, for example, can put up new shoots anywhere about 2 meters from the existing edge outwards, plus, I mean, some of the new shoots will come up within the clump itself, and if I did nothing it would carry on doing that, you know? So doing nothing is not an option really if you have a bamboo like this, but harvesting is the maintenance. They're one and the same thing. So basically, in terms of bamboo shoots, every bamboo species puts up its shoots at slightly different times, but they're usually between spring and midsummer, or no, spring and late summer, say. This one is a fairly early one, so these started coming up beginning of April this year, which is a little bit early, and they've virtually finished. New shoots have virtually finished coming up. There's one there, but some of my other bamboos are in full production of shoots, and when a shoot comes through the ground, I actually cut this off one of my other bamboos further up the garden, but I cut it so I can show you it here. That's what a bamboo shoot looks like. I cut that off at ground level, okay? So when it comes through the ground it looks like that, and it's growing very fast. So at the moment, I mean, the last week hasn't been particularly warm, and I think these are probably growing about 15 centimetres a day. Not that much a day. If it's warmer it can go up to more like 25 centimetres a day. You know, they're very fast growing. And basically these shoots, as I said, they might come up within the clump, they might come up on the outer edge and around it. And basically if a shoot is coming up, say in this path here, and I cut it, that shoot will not regrow. It's not like coppicing a branch. That's it for that shoot, for that year. End of story. So maintaining a bamboo within bounds means defining a boundary for it and cutting up any shoots that come up beyond your boundary. That's it. And as long as you cut them relatively small, say under 1 metre high, you can eat about the top foot, about the top 30 centimetres of the shoot. Now this one, I'll cut down the middle, and then basically this is how I prepare bamboo shoots in the kitchen. I cut them lengthways, and inside you'll see all the subdivisions there were going to be the nodes, which are these bits on the cane. So there's a fixed number of those, and the distance, the average distance between nodes is fixed for your location. So actually this shoot knew how high it was going to grow before I just cut it off a few minutes ago, because it uses all these, uses up the nodes one by one, and then it runs out and stops. And it does all its growth in about 4 weeks, and it never gets thicker than that. So that this, if it had formed a cane, it would have been that diameter, about 15 millimetres maybe. And once it's reached its top height in 4 weeks, it never gets higher than that either. But it does put out leafy side shoots over the next couple of years. So having cut a bamboo shoot, what you eat is basically everything that's white or light green inside. So you have to peel off the outer leaves, which are tough. Now that bit is, at the end, is probably a bit too tough. Now this is probably quite bitter, this one. It is quite bitter. You can eat any bamboo shoot from any bamboo, okay? But most bamboos, including a lot of the ones eaten in China, are bitter when they're raw, and so you need to cook them to remove the bitterness, and basically you just have to steam them for about 10 minutes. That's basically half of a bamboo shoot this size. It's not a huge amount of material, and you know, anything very much smaller than that is not worth it in terms of bamboo shoot size. The bigger the better. You know, probably the average on this is about 2 centimetres, and this is a good kind of mid-range bamboo species for using the canes as well. But I have others, so I have one up at the other end of the garden near my polytunnel that puts up shoots between 6 and 7 centimetre diameter. And one of those is worth about 20 of these probably in food value, you know, what you get out of it. But it's not quite so useful as a garden cane because you end up with something 6 or 7 centimetres diameter and 10 metres high, and you're not going to train a bean up that. You could probably build something with it or something else. You know, they're pretty wacky, great canes. So you know, some species are better for some things and some for others. So we harvest a lot of bamboo shoots. This is one plant here that I planted about 15 years ago. I've allowed to expand to where it is now. It can't expand any further. And each year I probably harvest about 150 shoots off this, plus about 100 canes. So you know, one plant can be really very, very productive.
When you harvest, can you actually store them for any length of time, or do you have to use them fresh?
Not for very long, a few days really. That is all, I think.
How many have you got off the plant at one go?
At one go, when it's putting up shoots quite a lot, you might get off this maybe 15. You know, one picking, something like that. Usually I'll try and check certainly twice a week when there's lots of shoots coming up, because they're growing that fast that, you know, if it's above a metre, you know, it's too late to eat it. You know, you can still cut it and it won't regrow, but the cane's of no use to you. So the other thing I use bamboos for, of course, is the canes, the wood in bamboo canes takes 3 years to harden. So although new shoots, new canes can look pretty hard, they can feel pretty tough. After 6 months even, they can feel pretty tough. If you cut that and use it outside, it'll rot in a season. So it'll last you a season, and then it'll just rot out of weakness. So that's fine if you've got plenty of bamboo canes. You could just harvest new ones each year. But if you want durable ones, you have to wait until they're about 3 years old or older till you cut the canes. And to do that is not necessarily straightforward, because after about a year or a year and a half, all the canes look the same. You can't tell by looking at them what's 3 years old or what's 2 years old. So what I do is what you do commercially, of course, mostly in China, is I put a dot of colour on some of the new canes for each year, so I know, and a different colour for each year, so I know basically. So for instance, there's some silver on the bottom of this cane. I know that's 2 years old. There's some black, and I know that's 3 years old, and so on. So if I want durable canes, you know, I know what to cut. And that doesn't take very long. I only go around once a year, usually in August, when all the new canes are up and still obvious that they're new, and just put a quick dot of colour on some of them, not necessarily all of them even. So yes, bamboos can be incredibly productive and useful plants. As a perennial vegetable, you know, it's early in spring. There's a lot of good perennial vegetables early in spring. You know, in April and May. You know, if you're growing annual vegetables, that's a hungry gap when there's not that much around. And certainly there's a lot of perennial vegetables can fill that gap really easily. And bamboo shoots are one of them. Another plant I'll point out is the one behind you here, which is a somewhat scrappy looking plant, but actually one of my favourites probably in the forest garden. And this is American elder, and you can see the flowers forming on there. It hasn't flowered yet. I do like elder flowers as a crop, and I make a lot of summer drinks and sometimes alcoholic drinks out of elderflower. And I use native elderflower, no problem there, but of course that only flowers for about a month, kind of mid-May to mid-June usually. Whereas American elderflower flowers later. It starts flowering in July, so it's probably about 10 days off, I think, till the first flowers open, and continues flowering right through till November. So as a fresh flower crop, it's fantastic. It's also not a tree, it's a shrub. It doesn't get higher than you can see here. It's a suckering shrub, so it slowly expands. It doesn't sucker fast at all. And each shoot lives maybe 5 or 6 years and dies back, which is why you can see there's some dead wood underneath it. So that's just old shoots that's died back, and new ones come up. And because it doesn't get higher than this, you can actually reach all the flowers very easily. You can just bend down the higher branches to get them if you need to. So it's very easy to pick as well, compared with native elder, which can sometimes, you know, get pretty tricky to pick. So the flower quality is also better, I think, than native elder. That's subjective, of course. No, subjective, sorry. I describe them as a bit more vanilla-y and a bit less cat pea, is my description of them anyway. But you know, it's a really good plant. Is in this location because there's a seasonal stream comes out of Dartington Woods, which is one side of me here, through down here, just the other side of here, and back into the Dartington Woods there, which usually only runs in the winter. But it obviously makes this a wetter site, an obvious place to have a pond. So I dug this about 10 years ago or so. It's relatively deep. It's about 2 meters deep in the middle. Comes up in shelving layers, so there's different niches, you know, for different plants and so on. And there certainly are some edible things in there and so on. But as much as anything, the pond is, again, it has system functions to benefit the whole system. So it obviously helps support a big population of frogs and toads and newts who all eat a lot of slugs, and those kind of amphibious animals like conditions, you know, under the thick growth over the whole soil surface, and so they're in there along with ground beetles, which also like those conditions and control the slugs and snails pretty well. I don't really have many problems with slugs and snails. The pond also helps support bats, so there's a very good bat population here. I have bat boxes in these 2 pine trees, but there's also bat boxes in North Woods in various locations, and so there's a lot of pipistrelles around, and they are, you know, all bats are very good predators of things like fruit tree moths, so like codling moth of apple and plum moth. So if you have a good bat population, you won't get problems from things like that. So, you know, I have apple trees, I don't ever get codling moth on them, which I put down at least in part, you know, to bats. There may be other predators involved, but I think bats have certainly a big part in that. So, so I don't harvest from the pond intensively. You know, I basically let it look after itself. It's a fairly wild area, really. The pine trees themselves, so far when I've been describing, you know, the function of different plants, you know, it's been this is edible or that is edible or has a particular use. But actually the main function of these pine trees really is to provide a shade area for sitting underneath in summer, because, you know, forest gardens are, you know, places where people want to be. You know, whoever's garden it is, they want to come into their garden, they want spaces to relax in and stuff. So we sometimes have picnics here and parties and stuff like that. It's just a nice place to be. So that really is the main function of them. Having said that, of course, pine trees have numerous other uses, apart from, you know, valuable timber and so on. So I mean, one of them is that the new shoots you can see on the pine trees here are very high in vitamin C, and in a lot of parts of the world those are used to make a herb tea, which is very nice. Treated a bit like a, you know, like a spring tonic in many parts of the world. And also I've been tapping these pine trees for some years now for pine resin. The one on the right there I've tapped for the last 5 years, and I've just started tapping the one on the left this year, which is what you can see down there. And pine resin is, I do that not because I can't live without pine resin, I could live without pine resin, but it's really interesting to show people that it's a simple process, and that pine resin is a sustainable source of complex hydrocarbons, and you can make anything out of pine resin that you want to out of oil. You might have to go a slightly different chemical route, but you can do it. And because of the price of oil, you know, over the past few years going up and up, and presumably it will gradually continue doing so, there are already things now that it's not economical to make out of oil that are made from pine resin instead. So commercially, tapping pine trees is a big worldwide business, mostly where labour is cheap, as you'd imagine. So until quite recently it was still in Eastern Europe, but now at the moment it's mainly in China. But you can tap any pine trees, you don't have to be in a particular part of the world to do it. basically the tapping procedure involves removing a section of bark, the outer bark and the inner bark. The inner bark is, on these trees, is quite thin. That's inner bark. It's about 4 or 5 millimeters thick, soft material which is underneath the outer bark to get to the wood underneath, and the resin seeps out of the wood basically, and you start off with a small face like that and work upwards week by week, making it slightly bigger and bigger and going on all summer. So the resin seeps outwards, you collect it, and then commercially that's distilled, and if you distill pine resin you get a liquid which is turpentine, and you get a solid left which is rosin, and then both of those have a lot of direct uses, but they're also used to make a load of other things, and increasingly, you know, I'm not suggesting there's enough you know, pine trees to fuel the world's cars, because there aren't. But you can, you know, you can use turpentine as a fuel. You can mix turpentine with vegetable oils, and you get a fuel you can use in diesel engines. So I mean, you could use it as a fuel. And I know people who do, on a, you know, on a farm basis, but you couldn't on a worldwide basis. You know, there's not enough pine trees to do that. So you know, it's interesting from that aspect. The resin, I don't bother to distill the resin, but in fact I use it when I'm inoculating logs with mushrooms to grow on logs. I'll explain that process in a minute, because I'll show you the top half of this tree actually snapped off in a storm. You can see the top, the jagged top there, almost exactly 2 years ago, and is just lying over there, the other side of these branches. And I've inoculated that with mushrooms, so I'll show you what I've done there. But on this pine log, I've inoculated this with a type of oyster mushroom that grows on pine. So the process is the same, the procedure is the same for these logs. Basically, if you want to grow mushrooms on a log, you have to have fresh logs. That's the first thing. You can't take old logs because they already have weed fungi growing in them. You need fresh logs within, say, 4 weeks of cutting, or in this case, snapping off. And you need to get your the mycelium of your fungus in there very quickly. What I've done here is I've used plug spawn, and that involved, and I bought that in because I didn't have anything suitable myself, because I wasn't expecting this to come off the tree. I bought that in, and if you buy in plug spawn, it basically will come in a plastic bag, and it's a load of little wooden dowels, just the sort you'd use in woodworking, with grooves down the sides, with a white mushroomy mass growing amongst it, and that's the mycelium of the oyster mushroom in this case, and that's all in the grooves of the dowels. And you make lines of holes, tap in a dowel into each hole, seal it over. I now use pine resin to do that, or you can traditionally use wax, and leave it. And then you've got to leave the log in a place where it doesn't dry out too much, for the fungus just to grow through it. And while that happens, you don't do anything, you just wait. So for a small log like this, it takes about 6 months or so. For a bigger log like this, probably about 2 years. So about now, really, I would expect. And in fact, you can see that's part of the mycelium of the oyster mushroom, where the barks come off there. And the bark's spongy all the way along, and that's the mycelium of the oyster mushroom underneath the bark, growing well. So with a log like this, out in the open, and with oyster mushroom, you can't make it produce mushrooms. It will do it when it wants to. That's when environmental conditions are right. It is usually late autumn or early winter. So I should get the first crop later this year, and mushrooms will just start popping out from anywhere, not where the holes were made, anywhere in the bark this year, and they will continue to do so every year until the mushroom has decomposed the log, because that's what the fungus is doing. It's gradually decomposing the log. It just happens to give us nice edible mushrooms as well at the same time. And this pine is quite a dense wood, so that'll probably take about 10 years or so. So there should be crops for about 10 years, in the order of 10 to 15 kilos a year, that kind of order, for an investment of about 15 quid in inoculant. So it's actually it's very good value over the lifetime. With shiitake logs, these are actually manageable. So once you've let it have it 6 months for the fungus to grow through it, you can actually make these produce mushrooms when you want. You basically soak them in water, maybe for 24 hours or so, and then hit them. Either hit them on the mallet, on the end with a mallet, very hard, several times, or if you've got a concrete floor or a concrete slab, you can whack it against that. And then mushrooms will pop out about a week later. And if you don't hit it, you might get 1 or 2 mushrooms, but you won't get many. That is standard Japanese technique where they grow shiitakes, or have been for hundreds of years. And I think what's happening there is you're fooling the fungus into thinking it's attacked a branch on a tree. The branch has fallen to the forest floor, and that initiates fruiting of mushrooms. I think that's what's going on anyway. And it is well known that fungus can detect shock. Don't ask me how, but it can. And then you rest this log for 3 months, and then you can do it again. So you can actually get three crops a year out of a log like that. So I have a lot of these stacked up behind my polytunnel. They don't need to be in a light position. Mushrooms do not need light to grow. You can have them in a dark place under some dark conifers or something where you can't do anything else in a garden. And you can have your mushroom store there.
So do shiitake need conifers?
No, they'll grow on deciduous or coniferous wood, but you need a different strain for coniferous wood than deciduous wood, so you just have to make sure you get the right strain. But that's not a problem. And if I'm buying in inoculant, I get it from a woman called Anne Miller in Scotland, Anne Miller Speciality Mushrooms. She's really good, has a good website, and is very knowledgeable about log cultivation and other cultivation of mushrooms as well. And it's a subspecies of annual leek, so it's very closely related to annual leek, although the flavour is not the same. It's more garlicky. If anybody want to try a bit of leaf, you're welcome to. It's quite strongly garlicky, okay? And basically in the right through from autumn until spring, it looks identical to an annual leek, and you use it like an annual leek. So you can either you can pull up or dig up whole plants, in which case it's not perennial anymore, of course, or you can cut them off at soil level and it will regrow, but of course you don't get such a length of stem if you do that. I often do actually just pull up whole plants because it's so easy to grow. It doesn't matter if not all of them are perennial. And then what happens in late spring, they put up flower head, as you can see. It produces flowers but does not produce seed. Instead it produces a head of bulbils, which you can just see starting to grow on these. Now these papery bits are split open. You can just see at the bottom the bulbils, like little cloves of garlic, just starting to grow. It produces a head of those. And in the wild, as that grows and they grow, this gets heavier and the thing bends over, touches the ground, and some of those bulbils root, and so it walks around. So the Egyptian walking onion, and any of you have grown that, does a similar thing. They basically walk around to move. But what I do to propagate this, I harvest those bulbils in late summer and just broadcast them. Just throw them around where I think they're going to grow, and I don't do anything else. And then the first year they'll be very thin plants, so some of the thin weedy ones you can see, like this, they're about 1 centimetre diameter. They'll be for 1-year-old plants, too young to use yet. 2nd and 3rd-year-old plants are much thicker. They will never get, they'll never get to sort of 3.5 centimetre diameter like annual leeks will in a rich soil where you've weeded them incessantly, and spent all your life looking after them. But they take me 5 minutes a year to grow, so it doesn't matter. I just pull up a few extras instead. So this, after flowering, it goes dormant to a bulb for about a month in most of August, and then in September it starts growing again and looks exactly like a leek again. And so you can harvest the bulb as well if you want. It's like a big clove of garlic, but not subdivided. It's one entire bulb with the same flavour as the rest of the plant. So it's a really easy perennial leek to grow.
Is it all garlicky, quite garlicky, the perennial leek? Yeah.
Yeah.
All parts of the plant.
Yeah, all parts quite garlicky. Yeah, and also it's proven very shade tolerant, more so than I expected, because it's a seashore plant, or grows on sand near the coast, and tolerant of quite heavy soils as well. This has actually self-propagated itself right under these shrubs over to my left here. Where it's growing fine under there, so it's actually very, very shade tolerant as well, much more so than I expected.
Do you tend to harvest them before they flower while they're tender?
Oh yeah. I wouldn't harvest them now. These flowering stalks, like on annual leeks, they'll be tough. Some of the plants that I grow on the ground layer are evergreen members of the blackberry and raspberry family, and there's 2 different ones here either side of me. This is the one that was by the gate, Korean raspberry, rubus tricolor. So that it doesn't have thorns, it just has hairs on the stems. And this is Nepalese raspberry, Rubus nepalensis to my left. And these are fantastic ground covering plants, evergreen, flowering now as you can see, and produce raspberry-like fruits in sort of mid-July right through August. I wouldn't put this one in a small garden because it's probably too vigorous. You know, it does need some management to keep it from going where you don't want it, because these are tip layering plants, so they'll produce arching growths, and where they hit the ground they'll usually root. So obviously you have to, with plants like this, you need to define a boundary for it, you know, to make them patrol that a couple of times a year, just to make sure it's not going where you don't want it. It's not a lot of work, it just needs to be in your consciousness to do that. This one is particularly good in fruiting in shade. You know, Rubus tricolor seems better really than the other one, but the Rubus nepalensis is a lower plant, as you can see, and doesn't spread quite so with quite so much vigour, but they both love shady conditions, and there's a number of others as well related to these. And I mean, you know, as much as possible I'm trying to keep the soil covered with plant growth all year. You can't do that everywhere, of course, because some of the things I want to grow are not evergreen, in which case, you know, I'm trying to make sure there's enough dead stem matter as well there to self-mulch in a way and keep the soil protected, because plant growth or, you know, or mulch of dead stems really protects the soil well in winter. And that, if the soil is protected, you'll get better soil structure, you'll lose less nutrients, you know, lots and lots of advantages, and everything else will benefit, everything in the soil will benefit. So, you know, they're doing a really good job in terms of soil protection as well. Looking behind me, you can see there's quite a lot of red currants actually under here. Red currants are absolutely fine in deciduous shade. They're probably our most shade tolerant of the common, you know, bush fruits, because they're very early into growth, and they've done most of their growing by the time the trees above them have got into leaf. So, you know, they're absolutely fine. Gooseberries are pretty shade tolerant too. Blackcurrants not quite so. You know, blackcurrants need a little bit more sun. And this is my other main mulberry tree, is this one above you here, and that's an American variety called Illinois Everbearing. Now, fruiting varieties of mulberries start fruiting within a year or two of you planting them out, very fast, whereas a seedling mulberry tree might take 15 years, so there's a big difference. So if you're thinking of planting a mulberry, try and get, you know, a named fruiting variety, otherwise you'll be waiting an awful long time. Those of you who don't know mulberries, the fruits grow like longish blackberries in a way, in terms of shape and size. And you know, we're slightly spoilt in a way by being used to picking things like apples and pears off trees. You know, those are big fruits, and you can take one pick and you get a decent amount in one handful. And of course those have been selected and bred for thousands of years to get to what they are now. Whereas a lot of the unusual fruits that I grow, things like mulberries or hawthorns for example, the fruits are much smaller. And you might instantly think that's a disadvantage, but actually it's not necessarily. So, you know, the fruits of this, I'm not going to shimmy up this tree and try and pick individual fruits, you know, I haven't got time for that. I will actually put a tarpaulin down and shake the branches, all the right fruits come down all at once. And similar with things like hawthorns, it doesn't take very long. Of course there's a few leaves to filter out, you know, that come down as well, and the odd spider and the odd snail actually out of a mulberry tree, because they like grazing on the odd leaf up there. You know, it doesn't take long. Harvesting does not take long, just because they're small fruits. And the advantage of a lot of these unusual fruit trees is, because they haven't been highly bred to produce big fruits and to crop as massively as something like an apple tree, they don't get stressed. The reason why apple diseases are such a problem is because apple trees get stressed every year by overproducing, because they've been selected to do that, and that stresses them. And as soon as a tree is stressed, it's very susceptible to all diseases going. So trees like mulberries or hawthorns or some of the other unusual fruits I've got, they don't get stressed, so they don't get diseases. There aren't any diseases, there aren't any pests that are a problem at all. You know, so from that aspect, you know, they are, you know, much lower maintenance than things like apple trees or pears or plums for that matter.